Some names disappear with time, but a few become so dangerous to remember that even history chooses silence. The warm spring sunlight settled across the parade ground of Camp Pendleton as Marines prepared for the annual Heritage Day gathering, an event where active duty service members welcomed retired Marines whose stories had shaped generations they had never met. Folding chairs lined the courtyard beneath rows of American flags. Polished brass gleamed beneath the California sky, and conversations drifted through the cool morning breeze as families, veterans, instructors, and young officers gathered together. Most guests arrived wearing pressed uniforms, carefully displayed medals, or jackets decorated with decades of service. One elderly man arrived differently. Daniel Robert Hayes stepped out of an aging dark blue pickup truck wearing a weathered navy blazer with no ribbons across the chest, only a faded embroidered patch stitched above the pocket, and an old pair of polished brown shoes that had clearly walked countless miles. His silver hair rested neatly beneath a simple Marine Corps cap, and an oak cane supported his measured pace, although every movement suggested quiet confidence rather than weakness. He carried no display of accomplishments and sought no attention. He simply approached the registration table with the patient expression of someone who had spent a lifetime allowing others to speak first. Behind the table stood Captain Ethan Walker, a respected 34-year-old Marine officer known throughout the base for discipline, efficiency, and absolute confidence in regulations. Every name entered into the guest registry passed beneath his careful eyes. Every visitor answered the same questions. Every form was completed without exception. Ethan looked up as Daniel reached the table and offered a professional smile. "Good morning, sir." "Name?" Daniel answered calmly. "Daniel Robert Hayes." Ethan nodded while writing. "Former unit?" Daniel replied without hesitation. "Marine Recon." The answer earned a few respectful glances from nearby Marines, but nothing unusual. Recon veterans attended Heritage Day every year. Ethan continued reading the form. "Any nickname or call sign you would like included on your visitor badge?" Daniel remained silent for only a second before answering in the same quiet voice. "Iron Viper." The pen stopped moving. Ethan slowly looked up from the clipboard, studying the elderly veteran as though he expected a smile that never appeared. Around the registration table, several younger Marines exchanged puzzled expressions before one of them let out a quiet laugh. Another shook his head. Within moments, the amusement spread through the small group. One Lance Corporal whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "That sounds like something from an action movie." Another Marine chuckled and added, "Maybe 40 years ago." Ethan placed the clipboard on the table and folded his arms politely. "Sir, I appreciate the tradition, but retired call signs are usually not placed on visitor badges. Besides, I have never heard of an Iron Viper in any official Marine history." Daniel simply nodded as though he had expected the response. "That is perfectly fine," he answered. "You can leave it blank if you prefer." His calm acceptance confused Ethan more than any argument could have. Most visitors insisted on recognition when they believed they had earned it. This elderly Marine did exactly the opposite. He made no attempt to explain. He offered no story. He asked for nothing more than a place to sit among fellow Marines. Ethan printed the visitor badge with only Daniel's name and handed it across the table. Daniel accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Captain." Without another word, he walked slowly toward the seating area, his oak cane tapping softly against the concrete walkway, while the faded patch on his blazer briefly caught the morning sunlight before disappearing beneath the shadow of a nearby flagpole. The laughter behind him continued for another few moments before fading into ordinary conversation. Yet not everyone had returned to smiling. Standing several yards away, Sergeant First Class Lucas Bennett had heard the entire exchange. The moment the words Iron Viper reached his ears, something deep inside his memory stirred. He could not explain why. He had never met Daniel Hayes before that morning, yet the name refused to leave his thoughts. It felt less like a nickname and more like a forgotten page from a story that someone had deliberately closed many years ago. Sergeant First Class Lucas Bennett remained exactly where he was long after the laughter around the registration table had faded into ordinary conversation. The name continued echoing in his mind with uncomfortable familiarity, refusing to settle into the category of forgotten military stories or exaggerated veteran tales. He had spent nearly 18 years in uniform, attended advanced leadership courses, studied Marine Corps history whenever time allowed, and listened to retired instructors who spoke with quiet reverence about operations that had never appeared in official documentaries. Somewhere, years earlier, he had heard the words Iron Viper spoken in an entirely different tone. It had not been casual. It had been careful, almost respectful. Lucas watched Daniel Robert Hayes choose a seat near the back of the gathering rather than among the honored guests in the front row. The elderly Marine greeted every passing veteran with a warm smile, occasionally shaking hands, but never introducing himself beyond his name. He did not attempt to correct anyone who overlooked him. He accepted every ordinary conversation with the same patient courtesy that had marked his exchange with Captain Ethan Walker. That quiet confidence only deepened Lucas's curiosity. Most people who invented impressive stories eventually searched for an audience. Daniel seemed perfectly comfortable allowing the morning to continue without recognition. Captain Walker finished checking in the remaining visitors before walking toward two younger officers standing beside the reviewing stand. One of them chuckled as he adjusted his cover. "Iron Viper," he repeated with a grin. "That is still the best one this morning." Ethan smiled politely, although the amusement no longer felt quite as satisfying as it had a few minutes earlier. If he wanted attention, he certainly picked an interesting way to ask for it. Lucas overheard the conversation while passing nearby. He considered saying something but remained silent. He was not yet certain why the name unsettled him, and years in the Marine Corps had taught him never to challenge another officer without facts. Instead, he quietly walked toward the administration building overlooking the parade ground. The office was nearly empty as preparations for Heritage Day continued outside. He sat before a secure government computer and opened the historical reference database available for instructional research. He entered the words Iron Viper exactly as Daniel had spoken them. The search returned nothing. Lucas frowned. He tried changing the spacing, the capitalization, and even searched only the word Viper. Again, no official record appeared. That should have ended his curiosity, yet it did not. Some older operational records had never been digitized, particularly those connected to specialized reconnaissance units. Lucas remembered a retired master gunnery sergeant once explaining that certain names disappeared from public archives for reasons unrelated to classification. They disappeared because the people involved never wanted personal recognition. Lucas leaned back in his chair, replaying the conversation from that morning. Daniel had not insisted on placing the call sign on his visitor badge. In fact, he had immediately accepted leaving it off. That detail bothered Lucas more than the name itself. Men seeking attention usually argued when denied. Daniel had simply smiled. Lucas opened another archive containing scanned copies of historical training newsletters, reunion programs, and retired Marine publications dating back decades. Hundreds of documents appeared on the screen. He refined his search repeatedly until one faded index from many years earlier briefly flashed across the monitor before disappearing behind an access restriction notice. Lucas blinked in surprise. He had only managed to read 2 words before the document locked itself. One of those words was iron. His pulse quickened. An ordinary nickname should not trigger restricted archival access. He immediately entered his own credentials again, believing the system had simply timed out, but the notice remained. It instructed him to contact Historical Records Administration for further authorization. Lucas stared silently at the screen. Outside his office window, he could see Daniel sitting alone beneath a row of American flags, quietly watching young Marines greet aging veterans with genuine appreciation. The elderly man looked completely at peace, as though none of the events unfolding around him mattered in the slightest. Lucas slowly reached for the secure telephone on his desk. He still had no proof that Daniel Hayes was connected to whatever Iron Viper truly meant, but every instinct developed through nearly 2 decades of military service told him the same thing. Some names were forgotten by accident. Others were remembered only by the people who knew exactly why they had once mattered. Lucas Bennett lifted the secure telephone from its cradle and paused for a brief moment before entering the extension for the Historical Records Office at Marine Corps Headquarters. Outside his window, Heritage Day continued with quiet laughter, handshakes, and stories shared between generations. Yet inside the office, an unexpected feeling of urgency had settled over him. When the call connected, he identified himself, provided his credentials, and carefully explained what had happened. "I am attempting to verify an old Marine recon call sign that triggered a restricted archive notice," he said. "The call sign is Iron Viper." Silence answered him for several long seconds. Lucas wondered whether the connection had been interrupted until a calm voice finally responded. "Please remain on the line, Sergeant First Class Bennett." The tone had changed completely. It no longer sounded like an ordinary administrative conversation. Lucas listened as distant voices became faintly audible through the receiver. Someone repeated the words Iron Viper. Another person asked for a file number. Papers moved across a desk before the line fell silent again. Nearly 2 minutes later, another voice came onto the call. It carried the calm confidence of someone accustomed to making important decisions. "Sergeant First Class Bennett, where did you hear that call sign?" Lucas answered truthfully. "An elderly Marine veteran used it while registering for Heritage Day this morning at Camp Pendleton." Another pause followed. "Did he identify himself?" Lucas looked through the registration records on his desk. "Yes, sir. Daniel Robert Hayes." This time the silence felt even heavier. Lucas could almost imagine people looking at one another inside the headquarters office. Finally, the voice returned. "Confirm the spelling." Lucas slowly repeated every letter. He heard a keyboard being used rapidly before another quiet exchange took place away from the telephone. When the officer spoke again, every word was measured. "Sergeant Bennett, remain where you are. Do not question Mr. Hayes. Do not discuss this call sign with anyone else until further notice." Lucas straightened instinctively. "Yes, sir." The officer continued. "One additional question. Is Mr. Hayes still present at your installation?" Lucas looked through the office window toward the parade ground. Daniel remained seated beneath the American flags, smiling politely as another retired Marine stopped to shake his hand. "Yes, sir. He is attending the event." "Very well. Stand by for further instructions." The line disconnected without another explanation. Lucas slowly lowered the receiver, his thoughts racing faster than they had at any point that morning. Before he could organize everything he had just heard, the secure telephone rang again. He answered immediately. "Sergeant First Class Bennett speaking." A different voice responded, clear, composed, and unmistakably senior. "This is the office of Major General Richard Donovan. The general has been informed of your inquiry." Lucas instinctively stood at attention, although he was alone in the room. "Yes, sir. The general is currently conducting an inspection approximately 20 minutes from your location. He is redirecting immediately to Camp Pendleton." Lucas blinked in surprise, but remained professional. "Understood, sir. Until his arrival, continue normal operations. Mr. Hayes is to be treated with courtesy. No announcement is to be made regarding this matter." "Yes, sir." The call ended as abruptly as the first. Lucas remained motionless, staring at the silent receiver. Resting in his hand, a single forgotten call sign had redirected a Major General's schedule without hesitation. Outside, Captain Ethan Walker continued greeting guests, completely unaware that anything unusual had happened. He smiled, exchanged pleasantries, and organized seating assignments while occasionally glancing toward the elderly veteran who had quietly accepted a plain visitor badge with nothing more than his name. Ethan still believed the morning's brief laughter had ended the story. Lucas knew better now. He walked back outside, blending naturally into the gathering without drawing attention to himself. As he crossed the parade ground, he noticed Daniel watching a group of young Marines helping an older veteran find his seat. The elderly recon Marine smiled warmly at the scene, his expression carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who cared more about the next generation than about being remembered himself. Lucas suddenly understood why the archives had revealed almost nothing. Some histories were never erased because they lacked importance. They remained hidden because the people who had lived them believed the mission mattered far more than the names attached to it. And somewhere between headquarters and Camp Pendleton, Major General Richard Donovan was already on his way to meet a man who had asked for nothing except the chance to sit quietly among fellow Marines. The Heritage Day program had just begun when the distant sound of approaching vehicles rolled gently across the base. At first, no one paid much attention. Senior officers often arrived throughout the morning to greet retired Marines before returning to their regular duties. Captain Ethan Walker glanced toward the entrance, expecting another routine visitor, and casually adjusted the schedule in his hands. Volunteers continued serving coffee, families gathered beneath white tents, and the Marine Corps band quietly prepared for the opening ceremony. Daniel Robert Hayes remained exactly where Lucas Bennett had last seen him, seated near the back beneath the shade of a tall American flag. He watched the young Marines moving with energy and purpose, occasionally smiling whenever one of them stopped to help an older veteran find a comfortable seat. There was nothing restless about him. He seemed perfectly content to remain unnoticed. Lucas, however, could no longer enjoy the peaceful atmosphere. Every few moments he looked toward the main gate, remembering the instructions he had received only minutes earlier. He had obeyed every order. He had said nothing to Captain Walker. He had asked Daniel no additional questions. Yet his curiosity only grew stronger. What kind of forgotten history could cause a major general to change his entire schedule over a single name spoken during a registration process? The answer arrived sooner than anyone expected. A dark government vehicle entered the parade area, followed by another staff vehicle carrying members of the general's command team. Conversations gradually softened as Marines recognized the official markings. Captain Walker immediately stepped forward, straightened his uniform, and prepared to receive the unexpected visitor. He had not been informed of any senior inspection, but professionalism required no advance notice. As the lead vehicle came to a stop, Major General Richard Donovan stepped onto the pavement with calm confidence. His uniform was immaculate, yet there was nothing ceremonial about his expression. He acknowledged the saluting Marines with a brief nod before looking slowly across the gathering. Captain Walker approached and rendered a sharp salute. "Good morning, General. Welcome to Camp Pendleton. We were not expecting your visit, sir." The general returned the salute politely, without slowing his pace. "Carry on, Captain." There was no criticism in his voice, but there was also no interest in schedules, speeches, or formal greetings. His eyes continued scanning the crowd with quiet determination. Walker stepped beside him, prepared to introduce the day's program. "Sir, if you would like, I can escort you to the reviewing stand before the ceremony begins." The general gently raised one hand. "Not yet." The simple reply surprised everyone within earshot. Lucas Bennett watched silently from several yards away as the general continued walking across the courtyard. Retired Marines noticed him passing and respectfully stepped aside. Families paused their conversations. Young Marines instinctively stood a little straighter. Yet the general seemed to notice none of them. His attention remained fixed on a single destination. Daniel slowly looked up as the approaching footsteps stopped a few feet away. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. The surrounding conversations faded until the courtyard settled into an almost complete silence. Captain Walker stopped several yards behind the general, confused by the unexpected pause. He looked from the elderly veteran to the senior officer, but found no explanation in either face. Daniel rose carefully with the help of his oak cane. His expression remained calm, almost familiar, as though greeting someone after many years rather than meeting the commanding general of a Marine installation. Major General Donovan studied the weathered face before him. Then his eyes drifted toward the faded patch sewn onto the old Navy blazer. A faint smile slowly appeared, carrying equal measures of relief, respect, and disbelief. Finally, the general spoke in a quiet voice that carried clearly through the still morning air. "I never believed I would have the privilege of seeing you again, Mr. Hayes." Daniel smiled gently. "It has been a long time, General." Donovan gave a slight shake of his head. Longer than it should have been. Around them, no one moved. Captain Walker felt the confidence he had carried all morning begin to disappear. Lucas Bennett noticed something even more remarkable. The general had addressed Daniel with the unmistakable respect usually reserved for someone whose legacy required no explanation. Whatever history connected these two men had not been forgotten. It had simply waited, hidden beneath decades of quiet service, until a single forgotten name brought it back into the light. Major General Richard Donovan allowed the silence to linger for several more seconds before slowly turning toward the gathering of Marines surrounding them. Every face reflected the same question, yet no one spoke. The general rested one hand lightly against the weathered patch sewn onto Daniel Robert Hayes's blazer before looking back at the elderly veteran with unmistakable admiration. "Most of you have never heard the name he mentioned this morning," he said calmly. "That is exactly how Mr. Hayes wanted it." Captain Ethan Walker remained perfectly still. Only an hour earlier he had dismissed the unusual call sign as an exaggerated memory from another era. Now the commanding general of the installation stood before that same elderly Marine with genuine respect. Donovan continued speaking, not as though delivering a formal address, but as someone sharing a responsibility entrusted to him many years before. More than 4 decades ago, Marine Recon assembled a small experimental reconnaissance team for missions requiring exceptional discipline, judgment, and absolute trust. The team did not use ordinary radio identifiers. Their call signs were never reused, never reassigned, and rarely spoken outside their own circle. One of those names was Iron Viper. A quiet murmur passed through several retired Marines who suddenly exchanged thoughtful glances. Lucas Bennett listened without moving, realizing that every missing document and restricted archive had been pointing toward this very moment. Donovan looked back at Daniel. He never asked anyone to remember the name. He only asked that the Marines beside him come home with their honor intact. Daniel lowered his eyes slightly, almost uncomfortable hearing the attention directed toward him. "General," he said softly, "there were 12 good Marines on that team. They all carried the weight together." Donovan smiled. "That is exactly why the rest of us remember you." He turned once more toward the younger Marines. People often imagine history is built by loud victories or famous speeches. In reality, much of our history survives because ordinary Marines quietly protected one another without asking for recognition afterward. The breeze gently lifted the corner of the American flag above the courtyard, and for a brief moment, the only sound came from its steady movement against the morning sky. Captain Walker found himself studying Daniel's face more carefully than before. There was no pride in the elderly veteran's expression, no satisfaction at proving anyone wrong. If anything, he seemed eager for the conversation to end. That realization unsettled Ethan more deeply than the revelation itself. Donovan noticed the captain's thoughtful expression, but continued speaking to everyone present. Several years after that team completed its final assignment together, Marine Corps leadership made an unusual decision. Every operational call sign assigned to that unit was permanently retired, not because of secrecy alone, but because those names had become symbols of a standard that could never be measured by paperwork. Lucas understood now why no digital archive had revealed the truth. The records had not disappeared. They had simply been protected out of respect rather than publicity. Daniel adjusted his grip on the oak cane and quietly shook his head. "General, young Marines have enough to carry without looking backward all the time." Donovan answered with gentle conviction. "They do not need to live in the past, Mr. Hayes. But they deserve to know what quiet character looks like when they see it standing in front of them." No one applauded. No one interrupted. The courtyard remained completely still as dozens of Marines looked at the elderly recon veteran with entirely different eyes than they had only an hour before. Without changing a single word about himself, Daniel Hayes had become the most respected man on the parade ground, not because he had revealed his history, but because everyone else finally understood why he never had. For several moments no one spoke. The morning breeze carried the sound of distant cadence calls from another training area, reminding everyone that while ceremonies honored the past, new Marines continued preparing for the future only a few hundred yards away. Daniel Robert Hayes quietly looked toward those distant voices with a gentle smile. "That is where your attention belongs," he said softly. "Not on old men like me." Major General Richard Donovan folded his hands behind his back. "With respect, Mr. Hayes, they can learn something from both." Daniel chuckled quietly. "Only if the lesson is useful." The general nodded. "Then perhaps you should decide what that lesson is." Daniel remained silent for several seconds before slowly turning toward the young Marines gathered nearby. Captain Ethan Walker stood among them without saying a word. The confidence that had defined him earlier that morning had been replaced by careful reflection. Daniel noticed the change immediately, but did not mention the awkward conversation at the registration table. Instead, he rested both hands on the top of his oak cane and spoke as though addressing every Marine equally. "When I was your age, I believed experience meant having all the answers. I was wrong. Experience really means learning which questions deserve your attention." Several younger Marines leaned forward without realizing they had done so. Daniel continued in the same calm voice. "You can memorize every manual the Corps gives you. You should. They exist because generations before you learned difficult lessons. But no manual can teach you how to measure another person's character within the first minute of meeting them. That lesson requires patience. Captain Walker lowered his eyes. Every word seemed directed toward him, yet Daniel had never once looked at him specifically. The uniform tells you someone's responsibility, Daniel continued. It does not tell you everything they have carried before putting it on or after taking it off. Lucas Bennett quietly watched Captain Walker's expression soften. There was no embarrassment on the young officer's face anymore. Only understanding. Daniel glanced toward a group of retired Marines laughing together beneath another flag. The finest Marines I ever knew rarely spoke about themselves. They asked more questions than they answered. They listened before they judged. They understood that respect is easier to lose than to earn. One young corporal finally raised a hand. Sir, if your team accomplished so much, why did none of you ever tell those stories? Daniel smiled kindly. Because stories become dangerous when people start telling them to make themselves look important. The mission was never about becoming unforgettable. It was about making sure everyone beside you could continue living ordinary lives. Afterward, the answer settled gently across the gathering. It was not dramatic. It was not delivered with emotion or pride. That simple honesty carried more weight than any speech Captain Walker had heard during his career. Major General Donovan looked around at the listening Marines. Write that down, he said quietly. You will spend years learning tactics. Do not spend those same years forgetting humility. Captain Walker finally stepped forward. He did not interrupt or defend himself. He simply listened, realizing that the greatest lesson offered that morning had nothing to do with reconnaissance, classified history, or forgotten call signs. It was about recognizing dignity before discovering achievement. Daniel looked toward the young captain and offered the same warm smile he had shown everyone else since arriving at Camp Pendleton. There was no trace of disappointment in his face, only quiet encouragement. At that moment, Ethan understood something no leadership course had ever fully explained. Authority could be granted by rank, but wisdom revealed itself only through character. And the strongest leaders never needed to remind others of what they had accomplished because their humility spoke long before their history ever did. Captain Ethan Walker took one slow step forward before stopping several feet in front of Daniel Robert Hayes. Every Marine watching understood that the young officer could have remained silent and allowed the morning to continue, yet something inside him would not permit that. He removed his cover, held it respectfully at his side, and met the elderly veteran's calm eyes. Mr. Hayes, he said with complete sincerity, I owe you an apology. When you arrived this morning, I looked at your age before I listened to your words. I believed my knowledge was complete because I had never heard the name you spoke. I was wrong. The parade ground remained perfectly quiet. Daniel smiled with the same kindness he had shown from the moment he stepped onto the base. Captain, he replied gently, if every Marine made every decision perfectly, there would be nothing left to learn. Ethan gave a small shake of his head. That does not excuse my judgment. Daniel's expression softened even further. No, but recognizing it is where good leadership begins. Those simple words lifted a weight from Ethan that no formal reprimand ever could have removed. Major General Richard Donovan watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction before addressing the gathering once again. Many of you have wondered why that call sign disappeared from Marine Corps history, he said. The answer was never about secrecy alone. Every eye turned toward him. After the final mission completed by Mr. Hayes and his recon team, the surviving members agreed on one condition before their records were archived. None of their operational call signs would ever be reassigned. They believed those names represented trust earned together, not titles to be inherited by someone else. Several retired Marines nodded slowly as though hearing a story they had suspected for years but had never been permitted to confirm. Donovan continued. The Corps honored that request, not because those Marines considered themselves legends, but because they refused to let personal recognition become more important than the values that created those names in the first place. Daniel quietly lowered his eyes. There were better men than me on that team, General. Donovan smiled warmly. Every time I have heard you speak over the last 40 years, you have said exactly that. That is one reason your teammates trusted you. Lucas Bennett noticed several young Marines looking at Daniel with expressions that had completely changed since the morning registration. They no longer saw an elderly visitor carrying an old cane. They saw a Marine who had carried responsibility without ever asking for admiration afterward. Ethan stepped closer once again. Sir, if I may ask one question. Daniel nodded. Of course. If you knew the call sign would cause confusion, why did you mention it at all? Daniel looked toward the American flag moving gently above the courtyard before answering. Because the young Marine at the registration table asked me a direct question. Marines deserve honest answers. Whether those answers are understood immediately is a different matter. Hey. Few quiet smiles appeared throughout the crowd. Ethan could not help smiling as well. The response carried no criticism, no sarcasm, and no attempt to embarrass him. It was simply honest. Major General Donovan rested one hand lightly on Ethan's shoulder. Captain, today you learned something every officer eventually discovers. Your rank allows people to hear your words. Your humility determines whether they remember them. Ethan nodded firmly. I will remember that for the rest of my career. Daniel extended his hand without hesitation. Ethan accepted it with genuine gratitude, and the handshake lasted only a moment. Yet everyone watching understood its meaning. No victory had been claimed. No argument had been won. Respect had quietly replaced assumption, and in that simple exchange, an old Marine had passed along a lesson that would continue shaping leaders long after every forgotten call sign had faded once again into history. Major General Richard Donovan reached into the inside pocket of his service coat and removed a small black leather presentation case that showed the careful wear of many years. He held it quietly for a moment before opening the lid. Resting inside was a polished Marine Corps Challenge coin unlike any most of the younger Marines had ever seen. One side displayed the eagle, globe, and anchor. The other carried no unit designation, no date, and no decorative inscription beyond a single engraved phrase that read, "For those who served without seeking recognition." Donovan held the coin in both hands before offering it toward Daniel Robert Hayes. Mr. Hayes, he said with quiet respect, this coin has remained in the custody of Marine Corps leadership for many years. It was created to honor the members of your recon team, but no formal ceremony was ever held because every surviving member requested privacy instead of publicity. Today, I believe the Corps has finally found the proper moment. Daniel looked at the coin without immediately reaching for it. His expression carried gratitude, but also hesitation. General, he replied softly, if there is only one coin, it should stay with the Corps. It belongs to every Marine who carried that responsibility, not only to me. Donovan smiled as though he had expected exactly that answer. That is why it has your name attached to it today. Every other member we were able to locate answered exactly the same way. A gentle ripple of warm laughter moved through the gathering, breaking the solemn silence without diminishing its meaning. Daniel finally accepted the presentation case with both hands, studying the coin for several quiet moments before closing the lid. Thank you, he said simply. I will take care of it until it belongs somewhere better. Captain Ethan Walker looked at him curiously. Somewhere better, sir? Daniel nodded. One day there will be a young Marine who understands that leadership begins with listening instead of speaking. When that day comes, the coin should encourage the future instead of reminding people about the past. Ethan lowered his eyes thoughtfully, recognizing that even now Daniel was thinking beyond himself. Major General Donovan turned toward the assembled Marines. There is one more decision I would like to announce. He paused long enough for everyone to focus on him. Beginning next year, Heritage Day at Camp Pendleton will include a leadership discussion centered on humility, quiet service, and respect for those who came before us. We will not focus on classified operations or forgotten missions. We will focus on character. Lucas Bennett smiled with quiet satisfaction. He realized that the lesson born from one forgotten call sign would now reach generations of Marines who would never know every detail behind it, yet would still understand its meaning. A young lance corporal standing near the front hesitated before raising his hand respectfully. Donovan nodded for him to speak. Sir, may I ask Mr. Hayes one question? Daniel smiled. Go ahead. The young Marine took a careful breath. If you spent so many years avoiding recognition, why did you come to Heritage Day at all? Daniel looked across the parade ground where retired Marines, active duty service members, spouses, children, and friends shared quiet conversations beneath rows of American flags. His answer came almost immediately. Because history does not survive inside buildings or records. It survives when one generation chooses to spend time with the next. No one hurried to respond. The words settled naturally into the hearts of everyone listening. Daniel gently closed the presentation case once more and held it beneath his arm beside the old oak cane. The coin had become more than a symbol of forgotten service. It had become a reminder that the greatest legacy any Marine could leave behind was not a famous name, but a better generation prepared to carry the same values forward with humility, honor, and quiet respect. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent across Camp Pendleton, casting long shadows over the parade ground where Heritage Day quietly drew toward its conclusion. Families gathered their belongings, retired Marines exchanged final handshakes, and young service members lingered a little longer than they normally would, reluctant to let the day end. Daniel Robert Hayes closed the small leather presentation case and slipped it carefully into the inside pocket of his weathered navy blazer. With one hand resting on his oak cane, he looked across the installation one final time, his eyes following the steady rhythm of Marines continuing their daily duties beyond the ceremony. Training never stopped. Responsibility never paused. That thought seemed to bring him quiet satisfaction. He turned toward the parking area where his old pickup truck waited beneath the afternoon light. Before taking more than a few steps, Major General Richard Donovan spoke in a calm voice that carried naturally across the courtyard. "Mr. Hayes." Daniel stopped and slowly turned around. Without another word, the general came to attention. Every movement was deliberate, free from ceremony or performance. He raised his hand in a precise Marine salute, offering it not to a legend or a famous name, but to a fellow Marine whose character had quietly shaped lives without asking to be remembered. For a brief heartbeat, no one else moved. Captain Ethan Walker watched the unexpected gesture with complete understanding. He immediately stepped beside the general and rendered his own salute. Lucas Bennett followed without hesitation. One by one, every active duty Marine standing on the parade ground came to attention. No command was given. No order echoed across the base. The movement spread naturally through the gathering until every uniformed Marine stood silently beneath the American flag with a hand raised in respect. Retired Marines who no longer saluted because of age or injury simply placed a hand over their hearts. Families watched without speaking. Even the children seemed to sense that something extraordinary was happening without fully understanding why. Daniel remained still for several quiet seconds. His eyes moved across the faces before him, from the youngest lance corporal to the commanding general, and finally to Captain Walker. The young officer no longer carried the certainty that had greeted Daniel that morning. In its place stood humility, respect, and a willingness to keep learning. Daniel smiled gently. He set his cane securely against his side, stood as straight as the years allowed, and returned the salute with calm dignity. Nothing more was needed. No speech could have carried greater meaning than the silence shared between generations of Marines who finally understood one another. After lowering his hand, Daniel picked up his cane once more and continued walking toward his truck. Captain Walker quietly stepped forward before Daniel reached the driver's door. "Mr. Hayes," he said warmly, "thank you for giving us more than a story today." Daniel looked at him with the same kindness that had never changed throughout the day. "Remember this, Captain. Every Marine you meet has a story you cannot see. Lead them with that in mind, and they will trust you long before they admire you." Ethan nodded firmly. "I will never forget." Daniel climbed into the old pickup truck, started the engine, and slowly drove toward the main gate. No one rushed back to conversation as the vehicle disappeared down the road. The parade ground remained quiet for several moments, as though everyone wanted to preserve the meaning of what they had witnessed before returning to ordinary life. Major General Donovan looked toward the younger Marines gathered beside him and spoke one final sentence. "History is not measured by the number of people who know your name. It is measured by the character you leave behind in those who come after you." The afternoon breeze lifted the American flag once again as training resumed across the base. New Marines continued preparing for tomorrow, and one elderly recon veteran disappeared beyond the gate exactly as he had hoped, without seeking applause, without asking for recognition, and without leaving anything behind except an example that would quietly guide the Corps for years to come. Some call signs belong to history, but the character that earned them belongs to every generation willing to remember.